turn the other cheek. It is one of the most famous things Jesus ever said, and also one of the easiest to misuse. For some people, the phrase sounds beautiful, a call to mercy, and a way to break the cycle of revenge. But for others, the phrase carries pain because they have heard it used in the wrong room when mistreated or abused. Someone is harmed and pressured to stay quiet, stay available, and keep absorbing damage, a misunderstanding that can become dangerous. So we must ask, did Jesus mean that faithfulness requires accepting abuse, or was he doing something much more courageous and disruptive? In Matthew 5, Jesus says, "Do not resist the evil person in that way," giving examples of tunics, cloaks, and going the second mile. These examples take place in a world of power, public insult, and social status, showing a way to refuse retaliation without losing dignity. Before applying this to modern life, let us be clear, this video is not advice to remain in unsafe situations or absorb unmitigated harm. Placed back inside the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is teaching followers not to let evil turn them into its mirror. There are two extreme ways to misunderstand this passage. The first is the way of revenge, where someone hurts me, so I hurt them back. Revenge feels natural and fair, but it rarely stops where justice ends, as one wound and one insult keep growing into a larger conflict. The second misunderstanding is passive surrender, where we call silence peace and tell the wounded person to be more forgiving while evil continues. Jesus is not inviting either extreme. He is teaching a third way that refuses retaliation without becoming passive and confronts evil without becoming evil. To see that, we look at the phrase Jesus quotes, "an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth," which in the Old Testament law limited retaliation. The principle was meant to limit retaliation and ensure the punishment did not exceed the injury, placing a boundary around vengeance. Jesus is addressing how listeners used this principle, moving from asking how much to pay back toward asking what kind of person we are becoming. Jesus goes further, calling followers to refuse retaliation as a controlling instinct, because the kingdom does not grow by returning insult for insult. Then Jesus says, "Do not resist the evil person." That does not mean never opposing evil, naming wrongdoing, or protecting yourself and others. The issue is the manner of resistance. Jesus forbids fighting evil on its own terms or letting the person who harms you determine your character. The next three examples show what that looks like: a slap, a lawsuit, and a forced mile, where Jesus imagines a response refusing both revenge and surrender. Jesus says, "If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also," addressing a deliberate public act of disrespect. A slap to the face is not only about physical pain, it is an insult and a public act of disrespect in an honor and shame world. Jesus specifically mentions the right cheek, and while a backhanded slap implies humiliation, the broader point remains an act of disrespect. The expected response might be to strike back to defend honor, but Jesus commands turning the other cheek instead. This is not a command to remain trapped in violence or let abuse continue forever, but a picture of refusing to answer insult with insult. The person who turns the other cheek does not return the slap, nor do they collapse into the identity the slap tried to impose. It is a strange kind of courage, the courage to stand without becoming what has been done to you. Passivity says what you did does not matter, but non-retaliation declares that wrongdoing matters while refusing to become its mirror. Then Jesus gives a second example. "If anyone would sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well." This is not a random clothing illustration. The inner tunic and outer cloak protected poor people from the cold at night under the law of Moses. When Jesus imagines someone suing to take a tunic, he describes a vulnerable person facing legal pressure, debt, and poverty. And Jesus says, "Let him have the cloak also." At first, that sounds like surrender, but the image is far more provocative. Giving the cloak as well exposes the greed and shamefulness of the situation, bringing hidden injustice out into the open. Jesus is not giving a simple rule that Christians must let exploiters take everything, but using a vivid image to refuse invisibility. The kingdom response is neither destruction nor quiet acceptance. It exposes the act and reveals what the system is doing. Then Jesus gives a third example. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. This line comes from a world where occupying powers could compel civilians into forced service, a painful reminder of who held authority. You had your own work, road, and family waiting, but someone with authority could interrupt your life and compel your service without asking. The first mile belongs to the power of the one who forced you, but Jesus says, go a second mile, refusing to be defined only as the one forced. The first mile says you have power over me, but the second mile declares that you do not control the kind of person I will become. It interrupts the expected script. Instead of resentment, fear, or silent obedience, the second mile turns the act into a voluntary moral choice. Not by attacking or revenge, but by refusing to let coercion have the final word. That is the pattern in all three examples: the cheek, the cloak, and the mile. Jesus teaches how to resist becoming evil in response to evil. This is the heart of the passage. Non-retaliation is not the same as passivity, which claims nothing can be done or wrong does not matter. Non-retaliation declares that I will not use your weapon, return your insult, or allow your evil to make me evil. That is much harder than simple passivity, forming people who can confront shame, endure insult, and expose injustice without copying its methods. This does not mean every situation requires the exact same response, because Jesus gives vivid examples rather than a mechanical script. A public slap is not private abuse, and a clothing lawsuit differs from domestic violence. We must never flatten all harm into one category. Wisdom matters, safety matters, and power dynamics matter, because the Sermon on the Mount calls followers away from retaliation without demanding accessibility to destruction. This needs to be said clearly. Turn the other cheek should never be used to tell a person to stay in abuse or silence a victim. It should not be used to pressure someone to remain in danger, or by a community to avoid the cost of protecting the vulnerable. If someone is being harmed, the faithful response may involve distance, outside help, reporting, authorities, boundaries, and safe places to stay. That is not a failure to obey Jesus. It may be exactly what love of neighbor requires, because love does not help a person continue in evil. Calling harm by its right name is not revenge, seeking protection is not hatred, and refusing continued access to harm is not returning evil. This passage is about refusing retaliation, not enabling destruction, and that vital distinction must always be protected. When turn the other cheek is used to keep victims silent, it becomes the opposite of Jesus' teaching, who never protects the power of the striker. This teaching belongs to a larger section of the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus commands us to love our enemies and pray for persecutors. Enemy love is not sentimental. It does not mean the enemy is safe, trust is automatic, or consequences disappear. The enemy does not control your soul. You do not have to hate to tell the truth, take revenge to resist evil, or dehumanize to confront harm. Jesus points to the Father who sends sun and rain on righteous and unrighteous alike, displaying divine generosity rather than weakness. God is not overcome by evil or cruel because people are cruel. Jesus calls followers to reflect that same character. Children of God are not meant to be shaped by the logic of revenge, because the kingdom is built on grace rather than retaliation. This is why the teaching is so demanding. It asks not only what you will do when harmed, but what kind of person you will become. So what does turn the other cheek mean today? It does not mean accept abuse. never protect yourself, or never involve authorities. It means followers of Jesus are not governed by retaliation. We do not answer insult with insult or let revenge define justice. We do not allow another person's cruelty to set the terms for our character, nor do we confuse true strength with the ability to strike back. Sometimes strength looks like walking away, telling the truth in public, refusing to be provoked, or setting a boundary without hatred. The shape of obedience may look different in different situations, but the heart of the command remains: do not let evil reproduce through you. Do not become the thing you are resisting, and do not let the person who struck you decide what kind of person you will be. That is not passive, that is costly, that is courageous, and it is much harder than revenge. Maybe we should be slower to quote this verse at someone else's pain. If someone is harmed, the first response should never be turn the other cheek. The first response should be to listen, ask if they are safe, help them tell the truth, and protect rather than silence. To understand what kind of harm is happening before placing a verse on top of it, recognizing that Jesus' words are not tools to manage wounded people. They are a call for all of us to be freed from the rule of retaliation, beginning with the person who wants revenge. It also confronts the person using power to humiliate, the community preferring quiet over justice, and the religious instinct avoiding truth. And it confronts every heart that thinks the only alternatives are to strike back or disappear, because Jesus gives another way. Not revenge, not passive surrender, but a kingdom-shaped resistance that refuses to return evil for evil. Turn the other cheek did not mean accept abuse, stay silent in danger, let evil continue without challenge, or pretend harm does not matter. Jesus spoke into a world where insult, shame, debt, and coercion were real, where a slap, lawsuit, and forced mile exposed vulnerability and power. In each case, Jesus teaches followers not to mirror evil, return insult for insult, let shame define them, or let coercion decide who they become. The command is not passive, weak, or a religious excuse for enabling abuse. It is a refusal to let evil set the terms of the response. So the next time we hear turn the other cheek, we should ask carefully, is it being used to call someone away from revenge or keep someone in harm? Is it exposing evil without copying it or hiding evil behind religious language? Jesus does not call followers to become people who cannot act. He calls them to act differently. People who resist revenge, protect the vulnerable, tell the truth without hatred, and refuse the world's violence. That is much harder than striking back and much braver than doing nothing. If this helped you understand Turn the Other Cheek, please subscribe and share. Next, we step back to look at the whole Sermon on the Mount, because these teachings are not isolated sayings, but a whole vision of kingdom life. So next we will look at every major teaching in order, asking what Jesus was really building from beginning to end. That is where we are going.